So just a little bit of context for those of you who are not familiar with these online series. It's part of a larger series of initiatives that started with a conference that we had on May 16th. And so this series is part of a continuing discussion around the production and circulation of fake news across time and space. So today we have two speakers that will talk about early modern texts and how fake news sort of circulate in those texts and outside. But in the conference and throughout the year, the initiative will also have people contributing from other disciplines and other fields. So if you are interested in the topic and would like to participate in our initiatives, let me know and I can add you to our group of scholars. I'm going to start with our first speaker, Ben, who is a second-year PhD student at the University of Birmingham. Today, he's going to talk to us about the concept of fake news and censorship and how they are intimately intertwined. But I'm not going to spoil it for you. So Ben, whenever you're ready, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, Carlotta. I'll just share my screen quickly. Can everyone see the slideshow?
Can you make it in exactly perfect?
Great. Okay. Thank you. So yeah, thanks very much, Carlotta, and thank you for inviting me to participate today. So the title of my talk is "Fake News and Censorship in Maria de Zayas' Short Stories." So just to give a bit of historical context about fake news in the Spanish Golden Age. So I think the concepts of fake news and censorship are intertwined intimately, since the proliferation of the former implies the expansion of the latter. So whilst fake news is understood in its modern sense is being propelled by contemporary technologies such as the internet, it's not the first example of the use of a mass medium to censor. So the printing press enabled text to be mass-produced on an unprecedented scale, and language played a central role in the creation of censorship. In Spain in particular, this development, combined with the presence of the Inquisition, created a historically unique environment in which what we might now understand as fake news could spread. And this can be seen particularly in the emergence of early modern journalism at this time. For example, relaciones de sucesos, or short news pamphlets. So within this context, the Spanish Inquisition operated. So kind of the popular image that we have of the Spanish Inquisition nowadays is of an efficient and culturally repressive institution, which enforced a theocracy through torture executions and book burning. However, in recent decades, the scholarship has recognized that the Santo Oficio was often inefficient and patchy in its approach to censorship, and primarily concerned with strictly theological matters. So whilst the Inquisition produced lists of banned books from 1559, it paid little attention to literature, and paradoxically, even less to novellas or short stories. And these had inherited a scurrilous reputation from Boccaccio and were often considered the most morally controversial genre of the Spanish Golden Age. So authors of collections of novellas would often include the word exemplary or ejemplar in the title and elaborate on their exemplary nature in the intratextual elements. So in the Spanish Golden Age, all books had to obtain certain permissions in order to be published. So the aprobación, or the approval from the Council of Castile, pre-publication, as well as the licencia, or license, to be able to be printed. So essentially, these collections of novellas, given a negative reputation of the genre, would try to counter this by employing the word ejemplar in their title, and elaborating on this in extra-textual elements or a prologue. So this might be considered kind of a form of fake news, kind of prefacing your material with extra-textual elements which don't necessarily correspond with the actual intratextual content of the novellas. I'm going to be talking about the genre of exemplary short fiction. So just before moving on to Zayas, my main the main topic of my talk today, I just want to talk about I just want to talk a bit about Cervantes' novelas ejemplares, so his exemplary novels of 1613, and their afterglow on later exemplary short fiction, which is the central motif of my PhD project. So the exemplar had existed in medieval Spanish literature, and the novella was a popular genre informed by the Italian Boccaccian tradition. So you have kind of two different traditions here. So Cervantes, however, pioneered the hybrid genre of ESF, or exemplary short fiction, which was evident in the oxymoronic title Novelas Ejemplares, or exemplary novels. Early modern readers would have been aware of the scandalous undertones of novelas and the moralizing overtones of ejemplares. So the Novelas Ejemplares inspired later authors of exemplary short fiction, but most were either unwilling or unable to imitate Cervantes' characteristically elusive style towards exemplarity or moralizing. So just to move on to the main author of my talk, María de Zayas y Sotomayor. So we know very little about her life. We know she was born in 1590 in Madrid, but her death date is uncertain. She wrote two collections of short stories, Novelas Amorosas y Ejemplares, or Amorous and Exemplary Novels, from 1637, and Desengaños Amorosos, or Disenchantments of Love, from 1647. She was considered the most illustrious female author of the Spanish Golden Age, and was called the 10th muse by her contemporary Juan Pérez del Montalbán, the famous dramatist, but was largely forgotten in the 19th century until she was recognized as a significant author in her own right in the late 20th century. She is sometimes considered to have been the first proto-feminist author and the first female author of the Spanish Golden Age to publish under her own name. So just to talk a bit about her two collections of short stories. Both collections, but particularly the second one, Disenchantments of Love, have content which a modern reader might assume will be problematic for the Spanish Inquisition. These mostly include depictions of abuse by female characters by male characters, but also include sexually and racially charged scenes, and occasionally abuse of male and female characters by female characters. She calls, as Brownlee puts it, for a return to the idealized gender relations she situates in the era of the Catholic kings, so Isabella and Ferdinand, whose joint rule marked the unification of Spain in 1492. So just to move on to the main subject of my talk, was María de Zayas censored or not? So Brownlee claimed that Zayas's work remained uncensored by the zealous literary expurgators of the Inquisition, but does not cite primary evidence, and characterizes the censors as zealous literary expurgators when in fact they were generally not. So I noticed that there appeared to be an unfounded claim, or academic fake news as it were, made on a variety of websites and blogs, including that of the National Library of Spain itself, that her two collections were censored by the Inquisition in the 18th century. So there are very few academic works on this subject. There's one exception, being Rodney Rodriguez's Momentos Cumbres de las Literaturas Hispánicas, or peak moments of Spanish literature, where he states that the collections were an editorial to success until the end of the 18th century, when they were banned by the Inquisition. So as well as this claim that her novelas were censored by the Inquisition, there's another aspect to it, which are intratextual variants, so variants within the text of the novelas themselves, introduced by printer booksellers across the 17th and 18th centuries. So these were the editors of the editions. So Julián Olivares in 2017 noted that Zayas had already written 8 of the 10 novelas, which form the first part of our 2-part collection by 1627, but was prevented from publishing them in Castile due to the ban on novelas and comedias, so short stories and comedies, which was in effect from 1625 to 34. So this is a very kind of culturally repressive climate at the start of the 17th century. Olivares argues that extensive omissions were carried out by printers in the 17th and 18th centuries of very long passages from both of her collections, in order to reduce the number of pages and thereby make the book cheaper for consumers. Conversely, however, he also asserts that the changes were carried out by male printer booksellers and compares the abuse suffered by female characters in the novelas with the with the textual changes to the text inflicted by these male editors. So there's kind of two sides of the coin: potential inquisitorial censorship and potential censorship by printed booksellers. However, so after checking editions of Zayas's collections, I already knew that the license to print the work was renewed for a printer bookseller from Madrid in 1724, before it was granted to another in 1729. So this was already making me starting to question, were these two collections censored by the Inquisition? So I then consulted the original 1784 renewal of the license to a Barcelona printer at the National Historic Archive in Madrid, which also references the granting of the license in 1763 to the same printer, as well as its later granting to another Madrid printer in 1795. So there's no mention of any prohibition by the Inquisition between 1763 and 95. And the censor is willing to renew the license in 1795, even if he believes the collection is not as morally gratifying as other more exemplary works. So here he says, en su sentido, I'll read it in English. In his opinion, that although this genre of writing does not provide the means of instruction which are found in books which guide the reader morally through warnings, it does not contain anything which opposes our holy faith and common decency. Therefore, I judge that it may be reprinted. So given that there were editions in 1705, 24, 29, 36, and 64, the only time period where realistically it could have been prohibited or amended by the Inquisition is between 1705 and 24, or 36 and 64. However, the Index of Prohibited Books of 1707 does not mention Zayas's collections, and there are no notable intratextual changes within these editions. So also the 1747 Index of Prohibited Books doesn't mention Zayas's collections either. And finally, at the end of the century, the 1790 list again doesn't mention Zayas's novellas. So the only stipulation made in the license to print the 1764 edition of both of her collections is that it should be reprinted. It can be reprinted, provided that it is made with high quality paper and printed carefully according to the original copy, which is signed and stamped in my hand. This kind of demonstrates that the grantor of the license is more concerned that the edition be produced with care on high quality paper than with identifying undesirable content, and provides further evidence that no outright ban or intratextual censorship had been imposed in the 18th century. So additionally, in the license from the Council of Castile of 1763, the same stipulation is made, providing further evidence of an absence of inquisitorial censorship. So in conclusion, it seems that inquisitorial censorship of Zayas's collections can be ruled out in the 18th century, a finding which is significant to my PhD project because not only does it disprove a false claim, or fake news as it were, about their editorial history, but it also shifts the narrative away from centralized external censorship by an established institution which has traditionally been perceived as intent on enforcing a theocracy. So my findings kind of question why false claims such as Maria de Zayas was censored by the Inquisition are readily believed and perpetuated. And I think this is largely due to the fact that this kind of claim fits very nicely into the largely true narrative that she was largely forgotten until the 20th century. And so my project attempts to move the debate towards a more nuanced approach based on the nature of individual variants introduced by printer booksellers. However, whilst the Inquisition may not have intervened directly in the censorship of these novellas, it does not preclude the possibility that fear of inquisitorial censorship may have motivated some intratextual changes by printer booksellers. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Ben. It was very interesting, especially, I must admit that I've never looked into sort of academic malpractice or sort of inaccuracy as fake news. But I do think this is a very interesting point that we should look into. We'll keep questions for the end of also Harvey's talk. Thank you so much. So Harvey, let me also introduce you. Harvey is my colleague at Royal Holloway, University of London, and today he's going to be talking about rumors, fake news in Shakespeare's and false reports, and how those are fabricated. And I believe you use the word hallucinates in your abstract, so I'll let you explain that yourself. So thank you so much.
Being reminded of the things you said you would do that maybe you won't do in the presentation. Thank you so much. Just quickly, I thought, Ben, in your presentation, I was really struck by the Spanish for mutilation. I think the kind of
that's right. Yeah,
super interested in that. I'll just share my PowerPoint. Can this be seen by everyone?
Yes.
Great. So, I mean, what I tend to do with presentations is put a kind of picture up at the very beginning and then do nothing with it. So I thought I'd change that habit and start with this slightly grotesque image from Claude Paradan's text of emblems, Devise Heroique, published in the middle of the 16th century. A kind of fascinating figure, but also fascinating text. He was a kind of emblematologist, I think that's a word, and cleric. And it's a compendium of emblems with kind of short descriptions. And I was struck by this one, which is this kind of long kind of serpent-tailed, bat-winged tongue. It's disgusting, really, isn't it? But it's attended by a short kind of maxim in the Latin, quotendus, where are you going? And a kind of little explanation at the bottom. And I think it captures something of the anxiety in the early modern period across Europe about the kind of dangers of the tongue, that this kind of free-flying, free-floating thing that has a life of its own separate from the body. So as I say, it appears under the question quotendus, where are you going, suggesting the ways in which speech has a kind of mobile life of its own. And I suppose in this presentation, thinking about Shakespeare specifically, I'm interested in when ideas or rumor or things that are said begin to have a life of their own separate from the individuals, but also reality as well. So in that kind of accompanying description, Paradan pronounces the imperfections and inconveniences of the tongue, describes it as being full of venom, but also gives a short kind of reference to a story of an Egyptian tyrant, Amasis, who instructed one of his kind of lackeys, Bias, to send him the best and worst parts of his murdered victims. And Bias sends back the tongue. So it's an idea that the tongue captures both the good and the bad. But really, that's all just a starting point to talking a bit about Shakespeare. What I want to do in the next 15 or so minutes is take a pretty whistle-stop tour through some features of Henry IV, Part 2, and to think through Shakespeare's clear interest in the dangers of gossip and rumour, which I'm kind of taking as synonyms for fake news, really, and to think about this idea, how this idea, the language of fake news, a kind of series title, sits within his drama more broadly. So I'm going to focus in on the prologue to Henry IV, Part 2. For those of you who don't know, it's a slightly odd play. It's not particularly popular in performance. And I think critically for a long time, it's been held as a bit of a dud sequel to the much more interesting Henry IV, Part 1, the play that comes before in the history sequence, and certainly less popular than the play that follows Henry V. And part of that kind of poor appreciation of the second part of the Henry IV kind of two-parter is it's often seen to be a play that Shakespeare uses to capitalize on the popularity of the figure of Falstaff from Henry IV, Part 1, a figure who was immensely popular. He went on to write The Merry Wives of Windsor, a kind of singularly Falstaff play. And so it was, capitalizing on the popularity of this kind of corpulent, loose with the truth swindler who leads this kind of band of idlers that follow the young Prince Henry around. And I'm also interested in this quotation here. I think this critic is American, so I don't know whether it's blind or blindy. But in an article of 2008, she says that rumour is Shakespeare's favourite historian. So I'm kind of interested in what that means for the way in which we think through Shakespeare's engagement with and use of history. So So I want to use this quotation as well as a provocation to think through Shakespeare's position as a dramatist, clearly interested in history, but whose primary objective is clearly not the factual accounting of past events. It's inconceivable to think of Shakespeare regarding himself as a historiographer, just as it's problematic to suggest it's because his plays engage with issues relating to politics or religion that he is a kind of political polemicist or a theologian. Nevertheless, in working closely with chronicle histories, those by people like Hall and Raphael Holloway, these kind of big compendiums of English history produced in the 16th century, taking account of how closely he works with those source texts, Shakespeare's plays provide a valuable account of the perceived relationship between history and storytelling in early modern England. Moreover, I think they allow us a glimpse into Shakespeare's world, which in its handling of things like gossip and hearsay, rumor, misinformation, and fake news, bears a kind of remarkable resemblance to our own cultural moment. Maybe the slightly flat takeaway here is that fake news, rumors, all of the things we're kind of used to talking about now have always happened, will continue to happen, and it's kind of unchanging. Even in tracking changes in kind of media and kind of literary technologies, this stuff is quite persistent. So where are we? To kind of paint a little picture of Henry IV Part 2, I thought I'd start with the very end of Henry IV Part 1, because as a sequel, Henry IV Part 2 picks up where the previous play leaves off. I'll come in a moment to the prologue of the play I'm really interested in, which in a fascinating way starts with the personification of rumour, kind of a prologue invocation in this kind of personified figure of rumour or hearsay. But at the end of Henry IV Part 1, the Battle of Shrewsbury has just been depicted. Henry IV is victorious over his kind of rebellious nobles led by Henry Hotspur. His son has defeated Henry Hotspur, Henry Percy, and has divided his military force in two to kind of spread out over England and rout the remaining kind of pockets of insurrection. You can see here at the very end of that play in a quite neat couplet: "And since this business so fair is done, let us not leave till our own be won, till all our own be won." There's still work to be done. So it's a play that doesn't kind of neatly wrap up. It's conscious of the way in which it's just a snapshot, a kind of vignette of a longer historical narrative. So this is really where I want to start. I'm going to do quite a bit of reading, mindful of the time, but this is a kind of the focus piece of text I'm interested in. So Henry IV Part 2 begins in a slightly unusual way with a prologue invocation from a kind of personification of rumour. "Open your ears, for which of you will stop the vent of hearing when loud rumour speaks? I, from the orient to the drooping west, make the wind my post horse. Still unfold the axe commence of this ball of earth. Upon my tongue's continual slanders ride, the which in every language I pronounce, stuffing the ears of men with false reports. I speak of peace while covert enmity under the smile of safety wounds the world, and who but rumour, who but only I make fearful musters and prepared defence, while the big year swollen with some other grief is thought with child by the stern tyrant war. And no such matter, rumour is a pipe, blown by surmises, jealousies, conjectures, and of so easy and so plain a stop, that the blunt monster with uncounted heads, the still discordant wavering multitude can play upon it. But what need I thus my well-known body to anatomize? Among my household, why is rumour here? I run before King Harry's victory, who in, sorry, I'm just moving the little window with all of our faces because it's covering the text. Harry's victory, who in a bloody field at Shrewsbury hath beaten down young Hotspur and his troops, quenching the flame of bold rebellion, even with the rebels' blood. So that's kind of giving the true account of what happens. Henry and his son are victorious. But what mean I to speak so true at first? My office is to noise abroad that Harry Monmouth, the kind of rebels, fell under the wrath. Sorry, Harry Monmouth is Prince Hal, son of the king, fell under the wrath of noble Hotspur's sword, and the king before the Douglas rage stooped his anointed head as low as death. So before she tells the truth, she's going to tell the exact opposite, that the king has been defeated and his son killed. This have I rumoured through the present towns between that royal field of Shrewsbury, Shrewsbury and this worm-eaten hold of ragged stone where Hotspur's father, old Northumberland, lies crafty sick. The posts come tiring on, and not a man of them brings other news than they have learnt of me. From rumour's tongue they bring smooth comforts false, worse than true wrongs. So rumour tells us at the very beginning of that play that she has been propagating a web of misinformation, capitalising on the not yet dissipated fog of war that hangs over England, that Hotspur, the rebel, has killed Prince Henry, and that Douglas, again one of the rebels, who in reality has been captured by the king, actually, kind of in this false sense, forced the king to stoop his anointed head as low as death. So you can imagine rumour kind of sending out her kind of tendrils across the nation with counterfactual claims about the outcome of war. In a moment, I'll kind of give a sense of why I think this is interesting in that kind of creation of a realistic sense of what England would have been like in that moment of war on the stage in Elizabethan England. That Shakespeare's doing something with a kind of evoking the reality, the kind of confusion of England in this moment of civil strife. But what's also interesting in quite a repetitive way is that in the following scene, the kind of opening scene of the play, we get exactly what rumour has told us she's doing play out. I'm kind of mindful of time, so I won't read all of this. But we have Lord Bardolph and the Earl of Northumberland in conversation. They're kind of the rebellious faction, not the king's faction, discussing exactly the kind of rumoured untruths that we hear about in the prologue. So the Earl of Northumberland asks, "What news, Lord Bardolph? Every minute now should be father of some stratagem. We've got to act quickly and capitalise on the events that he thinks are favouring them. The times are wild, contention like a horse full of high feeding. Madly hath broke loose and bears down all before him." There's a whole network of language in the opening of this play to the kind of the speed of horses and the speed of news travelling in post haste kind of out across England. Noble Earl Bardolph replies, "I bring you certain news from Shrewsbury." He hopes it's good. "As good as heart can wish. The king is almost wounded to death, and in the fortune of my lord, your son, Prince Harry, slain outright, and both the Blunts killed by the hands of Douglas." So kind of giving the false account again. Bardolph has heard from the battlefield that the king has been defeated and his son killed. But what happens next is we get the truth turning up in the figure of Travers, who arrives mid-scene. "My lord, Sir John Umfreville turned me back with joyful tidings, and being better horsed outrode me." There's a sense of people taking news across England, and whoever's horse is fastest kind of getting there first, regardless of the news they carry. "After him came spurring hard a gentleman almost forspent with speed, that stopped by me to breathe his bloodied horse. He asked the way to Chester, and of him I did demand what news from Shrewsbury. He told me that rebellion had bad luck, and that young Harry Percy's spur was cold. With that he gave his able horse ahead, and bending forward struck his armed heels against the panting side of his poor jade up to the rowel head and starts." So again, language, the kind of equine language you can see here in the poor jade, but in the previous slide, the well-fed horse kind of conflict here. I think Shakespeare probably showing off a little bit of horse knowledge there. To which Northumberland replies, "Why, he is dead. See what a ready tongue suspicion hath. He that but fears a thing he would not know hath by instinct knowledge from others' eyes that he feared his chance." So these two opening scenes are quite nicely balanced, and I just have a few thoughts about them really. But I wanted to start by just picking up on the image of rumour. So I've got here from a mid-16th century kind of emblem, really late century actually, emblem book, a kind of depiction of rumour that really chimes with the description that Shakespeare gives in the prologue to the play, being covered in eyes and ears of blowing the horn. And this comes down to us, this image of rumour, which I'll explain a bit more about in a moment, through Virgil's Aeneid. Shakespeare likely read the first half of the Aeneid in Latin, may have read the whole thing, but it was available to him in English as well. But in his grammar school education, would have encountered Virgil, and we know from this play, references that are so close to what he would have encountered in Virgil that he must be have had contact with that text. Here are two other examples from kind of illustrations from earlier editions of the Aeneid. And you can see, the one on the left looks slightly more benevolent, this kind of gigantic winged figure with feathers covered in eyes standing across the landscape. And the one on the right, a slightly more grotesque kind of harpy figure with winged ankles. So you can see I just kind of wanted to pick out a few of those points of contact between the Aeneid and Shakespeare's prologue. Upon my tongue, stuffed ears, rumour as a pipe, makes me think of this image here. I don't know, we don't know if he saw this, but certainly it's a kind of tantalizing echo of the image, isn't it? Rumours a pipe, my well-known body to anatomize. It's rumours talking about her body, thinking about her body in a way that certainly encourages me to look back at those images and think that Shakespeare was thinking about them. So to say a bit about rumour, Shakespeare is interested in rumour. This is the only instance in Shakespeare's kind of corpus where rumour is personified in this way, although there are some other minor examples in English drama from the period. But it's part of a much broader kind of network of interest in rumour, hearsay, babbling, tattling, kind of spreading of false information that sits across all of Shakespeare's plays. I don't really think there's any play that doesn't in some way think about gossip, kind of broadly conceived. But I thought I'd just focus in on rumour as a figure. So rumour really is a kind of sub-figure related to Pheme from kind of Greek mythology, often called Pharma in the kind of Roman mythology. And Pheme or fame or rumour stands as a personification of the idea of fame, bestowing her gifts to the gods and also mortals. The kind of gift of what we think of as celebrity today. But when she's kind of paying out her wrath, she will kind of stoke disrepute and notoriety, spreading rumours as punishment. Pharma is known for snooping into the affairs of the gods and mortals in equal measure, practicing, and I quite like this detail that we get from the kind of classical world, that Pheme would practice a kind of escalating warfare of disinformation, whispering and then speaking and then shouting these untruths so that kind of gradually everyone would hear about it. And I think that where we get the sense of spreading rumour comes from. So Shakespeare would have encountered the figure of rumour in the fourth book of the Aeneid, where rumour is described spreading salacious details of the romantic affair between Dido, Queen of Carthage, and the Trojan hero Aeneas, which I give a kind of little chunk of here. This is from book 4. You can see where he's getting his information from, describing her with every feather on her body, having as many watchful eyes, as many tongues speaking, as many listening ears, never closing her eyelids in sweet sleep. Of lies and evil, she is a messenger of truth. Now in delight, she filled the ears of the nations with endless gossip, singing fact and fictions alike. The vile goddess spread this here and there on men's lips, a kind of like working through people to spread misinformation. But again, that sense of a bit like Bias in that kind of description of that kind of dragon bat tongue at the beginning, that is both the good and the bad. Language is good and bad. Rumor is good and bad, has a kind of benevolent kind of gift giving, but also spreading notoriety and disrepute as punishment. So I was kind of interested in Shakespeare's kind of quite unusual use of rumor at the beginning of this play, like why he does it, what purpose it serves. I think it's fair to say that early modern audiences who are alert to the classical mythology he's drawing on, the appearance of rumour at the beginning of this play aligns with the epic scale of Shakespeare's serialized English history plays. But more than that, I think it performs a primary dramatic function in allowing Shakespeare to reassert the kind of febrile atmosphere in which Henry in the play and all England find themselves. It is, I think, a sadly overlooked but brilliant dramaturgical feat, a kind of theatrical cold start that allows Shakespeare to bring his play world back up to speed in a powerfully convincing way. So kind of the sense of picking up where the previous play left off, but in kind of quite innovative way. I don't really have time to go into it, but in what follows in the play, there are subsequent references to kind of misinformation, particularly around Falstaff, who is this kind of figure who associated with lying, inflating the truth like his own inflated body. I've got a slide at the end, which I might get to, which kind of fleshes it out some more. What I think is interesting is that in this regard, Henry IV Part 2, which is often taken to be the weakest sequel to the previous play, bears some resemblance to the play that follows as well, with its opening metatheatrical choric invocation, calling, this is from Henry V, to piece out the imperfections of performance with our thoughts. So in the play that follows, Shakespeare uses a kind of chorus prologue again, and in that, recognizing the limitations of the theatre in creating the kind of the world of the play, Shakespeare speaks to us directly, asking us to kind of help him out. And I think that aligns quite nicely with the prologue chorus to Henry IV Part 2, in that it would be making audience members think about their own relationship to news and gossip. I think it's, impossible not to see Shakespeare's early modern kind of open air amphitheatre, to not see it as a space where gossip abounded, where people would come to share news, true or false. And I think Shakespeare's kind of like punching through the kind of barrier between play world and audience participation with asking them to think about gossip and rumour. But I think there's something else going on as well. So the extent to which Shakespeare's English history plays function to reinforce various Tudor mythologies has been debated for a long time. In one sense, his English history plays are seen to confirm that the victory of Henry VII over Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth, the kind of last event in Shakespeare's English history plays at the end of Richard III, kind of seeing that as the terminal point of this kind of narrative. There's some sense in which it reinforces Tudor mythologies that Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch, was a really good thing, and that the Tudor dynasty is a really good thing, and it kind of brought peace to England, brought the Wars of the Roses to a close. But surely by beginning this play with a personification of rumour in unsettling what we understand truth and fact to be, Shakespeare teaches us, I think, to be very careful when it comes to the potential fabrications of history making. Whilst overlooked as inferior to the two plays that sit either side of it in the history sequence, Henry IV Part 2 is no less coherent or affecting in the ways in which it capitalizes on a porosity between the lived experience of audiences and the imagined experiences of historically situated but ultimately invented characters. In this regard, I absolutely support Blindy's contention that in Shakespeare's hands, rumour's creative potential allows him to transcend historicity in order to emphasize the indeterminacy inherent not just in rumour, but in history itself. I think Shakespeare, though not a historiographer, is alert to, is activated by, is interested in kind of dramatizing what history is as a thing, and getting his audiences to think about it. I think it's part of a larger context as well. So Barbara Shapiro, in her brilliant book, A Culture of Fact, published about 20 odd years ago now, is thinking through the nature of fact in early modern England from the 16th century through to the kind of early 18th century. And although I'm not interested in that, in this specific kind of Shakespearean context, although it does come up in some teaching I do where I teach a course on early modern witchcraft and think about kind of courtroom testimony and hearsay and rumor in early 17th century witch trials. Her book, A Culture of Fact, makes clear that there's this kind of interesting relationship between history and memory, and separate from that of drama and imagination. But that relationship shifts in this period. So Shakespeare suggests through playful dramatization and the figure of rumor, those kind of barriers can be disrupted, allowing for a form of history making rooted in imagination and fabrication. And I think by extension is asking us to think about how history is in some ways fabricated as well. So just to give, and I'll kind of round up relatively soon, I think, a bit of the context drawing on Shapiro's work, but also the work of others. I think it's really interesting to see how conceptions of fact shifts in the century following Shakespeare. But in some way, we might think about how his plays contribute to a kind of unsettling of what counts as fact and truth and rumor and hearsay. So Richard Cust has observed that throughout this period, the most common way of passing on news remained word of mouth. And I think Shakespeare's interested in news spreading through word of mouth. Of course, we get a proliferation of printed media as well, but with thinking about kind of literacy rates, news spread in a kind of oral way. And as I've said, it's utterly implausible to think that the large open-air amphitheatres of London, Elizabethan London, were not hotbeds for gossip and rumour mongering. I think Shakespeare's kind of drawing on that, particularly when you consider that some of the leading political issues, leading kind of constitutional issues of late Elizabethan England, were totally forbidden under parliamentary statute. And I think it's kind of a point of contact here with Ben's presentation around a wider context of censorship, both of saying things in public, but particularly in print. You could be done for printing as well as writing these things. And I'm sure that's the case in Spain as well. So during the reign of Mary, for example, new laws set heavy sentences for those found to be spreading, quote, false, seditious and slanderous news, rumours, sayings and tales against our most dread sovereign, Lord and King. So it's kind of always tied in with sedition and treason. So rumour, sedition, treason, kind of spreading of slanderous news that tied together. But in Elizabeth's own reign, she clamped down on seditious writing as well. So you can see here in the Elizabethan statute book, a statute against writing about the succession. I've drawn this from another piece of work I'm doing about the Elizabethan succession crisis, but it gives a sense of how much the state was clamping down on kind of the open, kind of free discussion of political matters. And in other ways, I'm interested in how Shakespeare's history plays capitalize on censorship in other areas of printed media in the Elizabethan era, as a kind of space, a forum in which the kind of pressing political issues of the day could be explored in a kind of plausibly deniable way. So looking back to previous moments in English history, but ones which resonate with contemporary Elizabethan events, like the question of succession, like what makes a good monarch. Should a monarch be a kind of constitutional role? Should they be elected by popular kind of election? Or should it be a hereditary process? Shakespeare's interest in these things and presents them in a kind of forum that isn't censored in quite the same way. So to add into that, Adam Fox has written a really kind of comprehensive account of the legal action taken against ordinary citizens in Shakespeare's England for what we might think of as spreading fake news and false information. And it shows how seriously the political elite took rumour mongering of the nature that Shakespeare kind of puts into the prologue to Henry IV, Part 2. In one instance, he describes Edward Limewood, an Essexman who was indicted as a, quote, common spreader of news and false rumours. So I think Shakespeare's really interested in these things. And I suppose my conclusion is that there's a lot to be gained from going back and thinking about how they're depicted in Shakespeare's plays to our own cultural moment as well. This idea of social media and the way in which that allows news and fact to kind of get ahead of things. You know, in Shakespeare's day and in the play that he's describing, the technology is messages on horseback, this kind of sending out. But I think we're kind of fundamentally grappling with the same things. I said if I had time, and I think I will, unless Carlotta tells me to shut up, just to briefly show that later in the play, we kind of get these images being reprised. So that opening image in the prologue of rumour is kind of echoed in Falstaff, describing himself as having a whole school of tongues in his belly, and not a tongue of them speaks any other word but mine, and I had but a belly of indifferency. I was simply the active fellow in Europe, my womb, blah, blah, blah. So it's kind of this body full of tongues, like the image of rumour who's covered in tongues. I think it's also a kind of flatulence joke. His belly's literally full of tongues, rumbling and farting, because he's kind of part of his popularity on the Elizabethan stage is he is just this kind of like grotesque fat barrel of a man. So it's kind of playing into that as well. There's also a reference later in the play as well to rumour, like a kind of having a double, like the voice and the echo, you know, sending out and hearing back, which I think I want to think a bit more about. And from Twelfth Night, babbling gossip. I was kind of looking at the network of words Shakespeare's interested in, and hear a long tongue babbling gossip, the tongue and gossip. I mean, it's not uniquely Shakespearean. Everyone's doing it in the period, but Shakespeare certainly kind of interested in that. And I thought just to show the spread of Shakespeare's engagement with gossip and rumor, I just took this chunk, kind of at the last moment before hitting save, from The Merchant of Venice, where, if you know that play at all, the merchant Antonio has got various kind of mercantile ventures out at sea, and the play kind of spins on this crux of all of the money that he sent out, kind of being shipwrecked and ruining him, basically. And here we have Salanio and Salarino, two characters whose names are meant to be kind of confusing and interchangeable, discussing the kind of gossip of the day, what's happened to his ships. And you can see in the language they're using, in my gossip report, be an honest woman of her word. They're caught in a moment in the kind of market space, gossiping. And I think that's true to what Shakespeare would have been hearing and seeing in his own London in the 1590s. I'll end there. I've burned up quite a bit of time, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Harvey. I think you were perfectly fine with time.